Ready? Perfect. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this Foreign Policy Centre SEPAD joint event. It's wonderful to be back in London and back in person with so many friends, colleagues, and back working with Adam and Poppy in person after doing so many things online over the past few years. It really is wonderful to be doing this in the flesh, as they say, despite the searing heat. But we will get through this together. It's really exciting to have everyone here discussing some really important and timely developments relating to questions of state, religion, and protest. This event is coming out of some work that myself, Ruba and Ibrahim have been doing over the past year or so as part of a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, which is looking at ideas of desectarianisation, or put another way, reflecting on the ways in which religion is being contested in the context of the states of Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain. And when we put all of this together as a proposal, we started thinking through the sort of the key ideas, and then protests broke out in Lebanon and in Iraq. And it quickly became apparent that what we were witnessing was an ongoing process of reimagining relations between people and the state, and also people and faith, people and different religious communities. And this process was described, Ibrahim, if you recall, as a process of reimagining by you. And I think it's a wonderful way of looking at what's been going on over the past few years since the protests began in 2019 in Lebanon and Iraq. A process of reimagining what it means to belong, a process of reimagining relations between people and the state, and between people and each other. And from that, we start to see a broader existential transformation, perhaps reimagining, perhaps, of what politics looks like in states across the Middle East. We're going to focus today on a number of them, and I'm really delighted that we've got three wonderful, rich panels that will allow us to focus on different component parts of these processes, ranging from focus on the state to focus on people and focus on the legacy of sectarian difference. But before we get to that, I must thank everyone once again for coming. Thank Adam, thank Poppy in particular for all of your hard work. We congratulate Adam on his very exciting new post. And stop talking and hand over to the chair of our first panel. Really, really thankful and excited that you're here with us today, Alistair. So thank you so much.
Very well.
The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the introduction to the conference. My name is Alistair Burt. I was for 5 years the Minister responsible for the Middle East in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as was between 2010 and 2013, and between 2017 and 2019. And in that time, built up whatever knowledge ministers gain of the region, which is by and large to understand how little they know and how much they depend on researchers and others to give you information that you can then work on to work into policy. So it's a particular pleasure to be involved continually in information about the Middle East, with which we all have an affection and an interest. So I'm delighted to chair this first panel to say, firstly, to everybody, thank you for attending the conference and the opening session. Our deeply knowledgeable panel is going to explore the familiar and crucial religious identities within the fabric of states in the Middle East, but also examine why, when sectarian differences are so fundamental to an understanding of the region and are absolutely part and parcel of how Western governments must approach the region, how despite that there's been comparatively little exploration of the reimagining of the Middle East in relation to sectarianism and the like, despite the occasional flurry that you might see in states where people say enough's enough and come onto the streets for something different. Our panelists, Simon, you already know, is the chair in international politics at Lancaster University and director of the Richardson Institute, the UK's oldest peace and conflict research centre. He's got a strong focus on sovereignty and the rivalry, particularly between Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran. And as Pro-Chancellor at Lancaster University, I'm particularly pleased that he is here, as indeed Ruba Ali Al-Hassani, who is a postdoctoral research associate at Lancaster University, and she specialises in the study of state-society relations in Iraq and beyond, with a strong personal focus on justice, law and social movements. And she co-founded the Canadian Association for Muslim Women in Law. We're joined by Ibrahim Halawi, a teaching fellow in international relations at Royal Holloway, with his research focusing at present on theorising the concept of counter-revolution and examining this in the context of the contemporary Middle East, where there is plenty of scope for research. So the three colleagues are going to speak sequentially, and then there'll be an opportunity for conversation and questions. So that part of it will be very much up to all of you who are watching the conference, both those who are here to ask questions when the speakers are finished, and those who are watching online to put in your questions. I will do my best as chair to get to as many of them as is possible. If you would say when you're writing in who you are, that will help us in identification, as indeed the people attending the conference. So thank you very much for your interest and attendance and involvement. And we're going to start, if we may, with Simon. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And it is great to have a strong Lancaster presence on this panel.
Absolutely.
Which still feels slightly odd to me to say that as a Yorkshireman.
It will, Simon, it'll get easier. The more often you say it, the easier it becomes.
It's been 10 years. It's been 10 years.
No sectarian.
And that's why I raise it. Because of a sense of tensions, long-standing identity-based tensions between two different houses from centuries ago, which now manifest in a friendly rivalry, or not so friendly, every May bank holiday between the universities of Lancaster and York, in a sporting event which pits various clubs and societies of the two institutions against one another. But it's taken a while to get to that point, and that is a point that has been reached from the evolution of identity-based politics, from the evolution of the state's role in mediating between different groups, and it's taken a long time. Dare I say, a bloody long time, bloody in the literal sense. So after desperately trying to segue my way from my Yorkshire roots to sectarianism and the state, I do think this is a really timely moment to reflect on these types of themes and questions. The background to this, as I mentioned just a minute ago, is this is a Henry Luce funded project, but it comes as well out of, it's okay. It comes out of work that people in this room have been doing individually and collectively over the past 4 years, funded in part by Carnegie Corporation from New York, which looks at the SEPAD project, which looks at tensions between different sectarian communities and their position within states. And during those 4 years, we've looked at Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, Kuwait, Syria, Yemen. I'm pleased to say that we've got some more funding to look at additional states in the coming years. But one of the striking things that comes out of the work that we've done over the past 4 years, and has really been amplified in the past year, is this real dominance and the real importance of the state in all of this. Whether it's the state playing an institutional role, whether it's the state playing a regulatory role, whether it's the state as a site of formativity, the state is central to much of what is happening. State power, sovereign power, really fundamental in understanding the way in which life is ordered within states and of course between states. And at the heart of much of this are questions about religion. If we look at constitutional documents across states in the Middle East, religion features heavily. Religion, a sense of belonging to particular religions, a strong sense of a normative set of obligations to faith, to culture, to tradition. Religion is right at the heart of these legal documents that are playing a really important role in ordering lives of people. Of course, there's also an of course, there's also an external component to this. As Alistair mentioned, the rivalry between the Saudis and the Iranians has a religious component to it. Now, that rivalry isn't purely about religion, but it has the veneer of Islamic competition, with the Saudis and the Iranians both laying claim to leadership of the Muslim world. And yet we also have groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, Hamas, other members of the so-called resistance axis that lay claim to religious narratives and discourse in an attempt to legitimize their positions and to legitimize their role within governance structures and also the state. So religion has a really important role to play in legitimizing actors, in legitimizing the state, in mobilizing, in governing, in ordering. It's the formal documents of constitutions or the informal residue of culture, of tradition, the informal ordering processes that have an impact. Of course, this really comes to the fore when we're discussing questions of sectarianism. And as many people in this room are all too aware, there are different approaches to the study of sectarianism, which reflect different understandings of identity politics and the salience of religion within these forms of identity politics, be it the primordial account, which views religion as fundamental to understanding tensions between different groups, or the instrumentalist, which views religion as a purely mobilizing tool, or the constructivist, which says that sect-based identities are constructed through the mobilization of such identities, but that there is something real about them. And to quote Stacey Strobel sitting at the back, sectarian identities have a stickiness. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. And this plays out in the context of states, because states play a mobilizing role. States have a role mobilizing such difference, or regulating such difference, or managing the contestation of such difference. Because the state is often seen to be the real prize of groups competing for influence. The state and its largesse has a really important sort of symbolic role to play, both in terms of a prize, an aspirational target, and also as something that is able to dominate life. And as a consequence, understanding those divisions within society and the way in which they are regulated and contested, as Ruba and Ibrahim will talk about shortly, is really important. The identity markers within society, those points of difference that play out within the context of states, are sites of contestation and sites of possibility, sites through which people try and assert power and influence at the expense of others. And the state has a really important role to play here, both in managing those types of contestations, trying to control what happens, but also in often exacerbating those points of division, those points of tension. And as these panels today will show, that dual role of the state and the dual role that it plays with regard to identity markers and points of division is really important. And I think that's kind of where I'm going to leave it for now, just kicking open a few doors and a few points for further reflection. The way that we've structured this is to try and piece all the different parts of the jigsaw together, both on this panel and across the day. And so my contextual remarks about the state hopefully just stress the importance of the state simultaneously as a site of contestation and a site of power that is organizing and influencing life. So there's that dual role, and I think that's really important. So that's where I'm going to leave my remarks and hand over to Ruba.
Thank you, Simon. Absolutely right. Yeah, yes, Ruba, thank you. I'd like to follow on, and as neatly and up to time as Simon's been, 7-8 minutes. Great, thank you.
There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. Arundhati Roy. As we have learned from the Iraq War experience of 2003, the foreign policy of many Western countries is usually disconnected from the concerns and interests of people on the ground, often treating them as collateral damage and as faceless numbers. However, policy decisions directly impact people on the ground: societies, communities, families, and individuals. The research presented today aims to amplify and center voices from the ground in public discourse, analysis, and policy. We do not claim to speak on people's behalf, but present our research findings to help develop a better understanding of the people's stories. Foreign policies are often rooted in perspectives that reduce people to their ethno-confessional identities, either pitting them against each other or assuming division amongst them in the first place. Primordialist approaches to sectarianism claim that divisions and hatred are innate to the people in question, which in itself is Orientalist. Such an approach is based on a notion of supremacy from the viewer's perspective regarding those on the ground as innately hateful, innately violent, and innately incapable of peaceful coexistence. Such a perspective claims to provide unsolicited education, democratization, and liberation to others. We need to do away with such approaches and focus on listening to the people who ache to be seen and heard. And they usually take the form of protests in order to draw governments and others' attention. Protests are cauldrons of emotion at the boil. They are society's collective attempts to be seen for who they are and have their demands heard. No protests emerge from a vacuum or from individual issues. The issues are usually interconnected and overlap. Protests emerge from sociopolitical structural problems that alienate, isolate, and disenfranchise pockets of populations. Often enough, those structures are supported by foreign parties and/or governments, and sometimes installed by them. This foreign involvement often overrides the people's wishes, which explains the recent protests in Iraq, for instance. In the Iraq and Lebanon protests, we see an opposition to ethno-confessional consociational governance, which has often exacerbated, if not created, social divisions. Much like sectarianization is a socio-political conditioning process, so is desectarianization. To learn and unlearn, as well as construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct identities, one must acknowledge and engage with the historical process. A society's identity dynamics cannot be decontextualized or dehistoricized. Social movements not only provide context, but are performances that engage in storytelling of the past, present, and desired future. While some protest movements may push for a desectarianization of society and politics, this process can only come from within the societies in question. A society determines when it is ready to proceed with the desectarianization process and what this process exactly entails in the given context. It can engage with other societies and learn from their experiences. It can borrow theoretical frameworks from other contexts, but to transplant the exact same process to more than one context is to push for an inorganic change that is bound to backfire. Protests are meant to make societies uncomfortable. They are meant to disrupt normal life. They challenge transactional sociopolitical dynamics and tools, which trade dignity for profit and privilege. And the law is usually one of those tools. As Muhsin Al-Attar, an international legal scholar, says, the law is transactional. Those who are in positions of power are able to wield the law to their advantage. But law is also existential, meaning it ultimately shapes how we see ourselves and how we see each other. If the law is anything, it is our prostration to the status quo. And this is why protests go out everywhere, to change the law, to make sure that everyone is treated equally. Protesters and all citizens want state institutions that recognize their identities and protect them. They want laws and state institutions that reflect self-perceptions and perceptions of each other. They want protesters never want their identities, religious, ethnic, racial, or otherwise, to be overlooked or erased. Instead, they draw attention to how they want their identities to be addressed, to be served, and most importantly, dignified.
Thank you, Ruba, very much. Our third speaker, Ibrahim Halawi. And Ibrahim, do you want to take it up? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to build on, thank you everyone for coming as well. I'm just going to build on the opening comments, 4 quick points and 4 questions to leave you with for the rest of the conference. Just want to start with this idea that the Middle East, the states in the Middle East are not formed in the same way. Some were formed prior to colonialism, such as Egypt. Other states were formed as a direct outcome of colonialism, such as maybe Lebanon and Jordan. And you also have other countries that were not colonized in the traditional sense, but they were formed based on some version of elite bargain between local elite and international powers, such as maybe Saudi Arabia or Oman. But despite the fact that these states were formed in different contexts and based on different relations with colonial powers, they all have done the same thing when it comes to religious identities. They have mismanaged religious identities. So some states, as Simon mentioned, derive their legitimacy from a specific religious understanding. And this, of course, inherently produces divisive behaviors, policies, narratives within the communities. I'm thinking here, of course, of countries like Saudi Arabia. But other states have actually derived their legitimacy eventually based on the negation of religious identity, some sort of national identity that was parachuted on society in an inorganic manner. And in a sense, it was an implicit way of repressing the diversity within that society. And potentially this is a form of desectarianization, right? It's a state saying, the way I'm going to manage the diversity in my society is by literally saying no one should talk about it. So these are different states. They behave differently when it comes to the diversity of society. But essentially, the outcome is the same. Also, when I think about this kind of desectarianism, I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein as well. Before the invasion, I mean, we all had this shallow understanding of the secularism of the Ba'ath, but we really realized then when we started digging a bit more, people like Toby did, and I think Fanar coined this idea of mismanaging the Iraqi society under Saddam Hussein, the religious communities within society, through things like fear, but also manipulation, creating divisions within communities under the surface of this nationalist slogan. So, in other words, our starting point should be that regardless what kind of state we're talking about, in this region, none of these states, intentionally or unintentionally, manage to deal with the diversity in a constructive manner that leads to some kind of inclusive development and meaningful political participation. So these are my initial comments. So I'm going to leave you with 4 questions for the rest of the conference. Questions that I think policymakers don't like to hear because they're a bit too theoretical. 1, what do we mean by the state? So what lines are we drawing around the state? Are we talking strictly about the institutions? Or are we including the elite that govern? And also, are we drawing a rigid line between the state and society? Or are we thinking of the state as something of an interactive thing that happens between social forces and institutions? Secondly, are we thinking, oh no, that's also part of thinking of the state. Are we thinking of the state as something that is very much local? Or is it an international actor by nature, in the sense that the way it behaves with its own religious communities is the product of its interaction with the international system? So how much the international affects what we mean by the state? The second question is, what do we mean by religious identities? So is it just me, let's say, saying I'm Muslim? Yeah, anyway, does that make it a religious identity? Does this have eminently political implications on how I behave? Or are we thinking about the politicization of religious beliefs? So we have to think about mobilization as being religious identity strictly so. Thirdly, given that politics is contentious by nature, surely there are different ways in which this large-scale mismanagement of society is triggering, not just through the Arab Spring, but also before then. forms of challenging, resisting, and reimagining of what the state should be like. And I think for us to understand the intensification of these challenges in the past decade, we really need to go a little bit back and see what did we miss? What are the things, the tensions that have been happening in society because of this mismanagement that we have not been tapping into, neither as policymakers nor as researchers? Last point is on this reimagination. I would like us in this conference not to think about the Middle East as an island that exists outside international development. And I think in the current international climate, global economic crisis that is imminent, it triggers insecurity and populism. We all know this. And this leads to crisis of legitimacy, varying degrees of crisis of legitimacy for states, which invites communal identities. So whatever we see in the Middle East today or tomorrow is not something isolated from the rise of tensions and insecurities, even at an established states. So it's very important to put the Middle East in this context as well. And in times of global economic crisis, it's very hard to imagine. I think reimagination becomes a privilege. Maybe the middle classes have time to reimagine what kind of state they want. But the point is, in the next 10 years, given the climate, economic climate, people in the region will not have the privilege of really reimagining what kind of state they want and what role religion plays in their everyday life. Thanks.
Thanks, Ibrahim, very much. Everyone's spoken absolutely to time, so we have about half an hour to discuss the various challenges that have been knocked up for us. So I'm looking, firstly at the room where I can see everyone. I'm also sort of looking at the screen and the chat room Q&A. Please pop your questions in wherever you wish. But I will happily sort of take the start as a Western policymaker and just give you a feel about that. Firstly, I challenge the perception that Western states were not interested in the condition of the people, in that the whole G8B MENA process, in which Western states worked with states in the region and civil society to examine the problems of society collectively, was an exercise in trying to bring civil societies closer to their states. The one I remember particularly was Doha 2011, when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was watching the demonstrations in Tunis. And I know this because I was standing with her. And we were watching the demonstrations in Tunis and realizing that this was different. The protests were of a different order. They had lasted quite some time since Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolated and died some weeks later. But something was going on. And it was that day she made her speech to, if I remember rightly, a room of very stony-faced leaders from the region. The foundation sinking into the sand. If you don't handle the social issues that are emerging, then things are at risk. Now, granted, the interest of the West may have been stability. If you're not handling these, then you're going to be in trouble, but we're all going to be in trouble. But it was a genuine recognition that there was something going on that these states weren't addressing. And in all that, trying to avoid the sense that religion and identity was used by those in power to keep themselves in power was a very strong sense. Western states looked at what was happening and said, we know what's going on. People use religious identity for their own purposes, whether they're in power, whether they're not in power. And I worry about how a state can survive when different faiths are competing deliberately for dominance in space. Where you have faiths that are living together with tolerance, then you can create a state that encompasses all the interests and beliefs of all. But where you have faiths or elements of the same faith deliberately competing for supremacy, how do you build a state that incorporates that? And I think the interest of Western states who now recognize with humility, we didn't get all this right from our perspective, but how do we get it right in the future? How do we identify this? But can you persuade us that desectarianism will actually impact on those in power who rely on sectarianism one way or another to keep themselves in position. What do you think? I mean, have I framed the question rightly, even if I don't have the answers? Please.
I think that's really, really interesting, and thank you for sharing your insight and your experience there. So picking up on that, there's a big survey that we've done, and I'm really pleased that Basha's here, who's helped me understand all the numbers. So thank you, Basha. And we've been looking through the various results of a survey that was conducted in Lebanon, Iraq, and Kuwait across the past couple of years. It was done post-COVID and ostensibly under the banner of understanding the impact that COVID had on social relations. But it was also designed in such a way to better understand the way in which groups related to one another and to the state. Now, this came at a particular moment in time, so it is certainly shaped by the post-revolutionary moment, post-2019. But we were asking questions about national priorities, about the sense of belonging, how do you identify yourself? And there are some interesting results here. People could identify in lots of different ways, be it along religious lines, along political party lines. And in both Iraq and Lebanon, protesters were more likely to identify with their nation than the non-protesters. So there was this sense of a nationalism at play in the protest movement, which transcended those communal identities. So there is this sense that there is a broader idea of belonging, and that in part is along identity-based lines, but it's also driven by interest. So in Iraq, poverty was seen as the national priority. So huge socioeconomic challenges. This is coming from the data from the survey. And democracy was seen as the national priority in Lebanon. So religion played an important role in various different ways, but the big driving force was poverty, democracy, and this sense of a broader collective membership. So it wasn't that how do Sunni and Shia live together, Sunni Shia Kurd, Sunni Shia Christian, etc., how do they live together? There was this sense of a broader collective identity. And I think that points to the possibility of a different type of state that you're sort of asking about, Alistair, and I know you've been working through some of these questions, Ibrahim, in a different career path. I hope that helped and sheds a bit more light on things.
What do you think, the possibility of this helping to shape a different state? Ruba?
I want to go back to something you said about bringing societies closer to states. And this speaks to my doctoral work, which is about redefining what the state is and what the sovereign state is. And maybe we should redefine what the state is, because Ibrahim, asked that question, how do you define it? And perhaps one way we can approach this is by including the people and the popular will as part of the state. So instead of the literature that talks about popular sovereignty on one hand and state sovereignty on the other, maybe a state is not a state without the people's self-determination. So Iraq, for example, during Saddam's time was seen as a sovereign state, but the people were not sovereign. They were under a cruel, ruthless, genocidal dictatorship for decades. But international norms treated them as a sovereign state and imposed sanctions based on that idea of what the state is, and the people suffered. So maybe one way to address all of this is by redefining what the state is. And instead of saying bringing societies closer to the state, we can say bring societies closer to state institutions that speak to their demands and their needs. So as Simon said, Iraq has a growing poverty rate, around 40% of the population. And at the same time, over 40% of the population are youth under the age of 21. So we're talking about a generational shift that's taking place. And this contributed to the protest movement, where there's a generation that has nothing to lose, no employment to lose, no life savings to lose, nothing. And they're the ones who are pushing for change. Right now, there may be some sense of despair because nothing has happened immediately after the protest movement, but the mobilization is still there on the grassroots level. And I would be very curious to see what will happen over the long term, because this is a patient generation, yet at the same time stubborn. And they will continue pushing for change, even if there are state institutions that are either not built for them or are built to repress them.
Ibrahim, did we see anything in the protests in Lebanon that, by leading presumably directly to the creation of the independent bloc of MPs that are now in Parliament after the election, not a large group, but certainly something that wasn't there before, is this a demonstration that Lebanon is on the way to recognizing the importance of desectarianism in dealing with its problems, or does that small group simply suggest actually it is small and those controlling the sectarian blocs remain very much in place? What's your picture?
I'll start from there, but I'll then return to a policy. I'd like to give some tangible suggestion on the question of where to go from here with the state. I think if you look at the numbers in the last parliamentary elections in Lebanon, these 13 MPs got 30 to 40% of the popular vote. But the electoral law in Lebanon, because it's a constitutional democracy, sort of limits how the seats are allocated in some sense. So indeed, it's a promising start. But also we have to put it in the context of one of the deepest economic crises in modern history. It's one of the largest destruction of wealth per capita in modern history. So it could be also a voice of a reactionary vote by sectarian communities against their sectarian patrons. So they kind of voted as a way of saying, we're not happy in this context, right? So it might not be a sustainable voice of reimagining basically what the state should be, right? It could be just sectarian communities saying, this is not going well. So so sectarian patrons should do something about it. So it's a reformist call rather than a call to fundamentally change the nature of the state. So I think we're still stuck with the imagination of consociational arrangement, but the people want their consociational patrons to behave better, right? To be a bit more competent in how they make policy. So that's a cynical view on Lebanon, but I just want to return to the question you raised. From your perspective, right, I'm not going to speak as an academic, from the perspective of Britain, which I understand the priority is stability. We have realized that the kind of stability that Britain has been investing in is not sustainable. You keep sort of buying time, right? So just trying to keep things intact. And that has two things to think about. One is that the rewards of economic development. Think of Egypt before 2011. The IMF was saying this is the role model of economic development in the global south. The report in 2010 said this is the lesson for every other global south country. This is how you invest. This is how you grow. A year later, things imploded. So one, the rewards of economic development, which of course Britain and other countries have considered to be the way forward, have been concentrated in the hands of the few privileged elite. This is not sustainable. Now, the state, which Britain still relies on to produce that stability, is itself invested in increasing this gap, because the state is heavily sort of colluding with these privileged networks. Policymakers, they can be mechanical in normal times, but in the midst of a crisis, that's when it matters. I'll take Lebanon, for example, now. Lebanon now has two options. You either do another Taif agreement in Saudi Arabia in which you bring all the consociational patrons, you give them some money, and things move forward, or you build the foundations of a civil state. That does not reduce the role of faith or religious identities in society, but it makes sure that religious communities are no longer fighting existentially to have access to resources. If all of these people are just citizens of a state, then the question of religious communities become cultural rather than political. So the state is again detached from the struggle between each other. And this, of course, needs visionary policymakers, which until further notice, I haven't seen any bold move in that direction. But in moments of crisis, this is when I expect policymakers to say, right, this is the moment in which we can pressure consociational patrons to consider moving from a constitutional democracy to a civil state, which ensures the rights and access to resources and privileges for sectarian communities, but does not reduce the legitimacy of the state to sectarianism.
Almost every reordering of society in the manner you describe must involve a degree of sacrifice somewhere, because those who currently have power, if a model is to be changed that will be different, will need to appreciate that they are giving something up. Do you think that process, because of the tragedies that have affected Lebanon and the issues over many years of external engagement and the damage done to the people, do you think those in power have reached that stage, or is there still a longer period to go?
I think they're rational actors, and they're testing whether the region and the international powers are still willing to support them with funds and money without them doing any serious reform. So they're bluffing even with international actors. So this depends on international actors, whether they are ready to corner them even more, and therefore they will have to deal with an even more insecure setting internally, and then force these concessions on them. But they are rational actors, it's a crisis, so it depends how much the regional and international sponsors would be willing to push for these kind of concessions. Otherwise, yes, they can buy time, they can impoverish society even more, but stability would not be on the table in the next 10 years, because they can do what Erdogan did. They are on the Mediterranean, they have enough refugees and poor people to blackmail Europe into another crisis. So stability has to be a bit more bold and visionary rather than buying time.
Thanks very much. Ruba, of course.
Sorry, I just want to add a point. I keep on thinking of the US at this point in history, where there are competing faiths and denominations for power in the Supreme Court in recent decisions about fundamental human and health rights for women, for example, a huge chunk of the population, and what this means for stability. So we should approach the Middle East just like we would approach any other country around the world. You know, so we want stability, but at the same time, we want to make sure that when we do interact with that government and with that, you know, population, we're not violating human rights and we're not supporting the violation of human rights, because often in the Middle East, it has been treated very differently from other countries around the world. And, you know, human rights continue to be violated, and foreign intervention has constantly supported the violation of human rights in the name of stability. So we need to prioritize. You know, stability is a priority, but at the same time, human rights are the greatest, you know, priority. I hope I'm making sense.
You do make sense, and I think I acknowledged earlier, I think events are rightly recasting some a look back at policy and hopefully a look forward as well. We now have some questions coming in. Yes, please, madam, if you would say who you are and represent, that would be great.
Okay, my name is Sana, and I just wanted to, I think it's not a question, or maybe it's a question or a comment. I agree what you said, but from my understanding on the rule that elites should play. But what about the role of grassroots movements? For me, the way you talk about the change in Lebanon, it is kind of pathetic because it's top bottom, it's not bottom up. So I wonder what's your take on that, because that's a major issue.
Yeah, just a quick answer. I'm classical in my politics. I strongly believe that history is designed by aspiring elites and traditional elites. And aspiring elites can come out of grassroots movements. But sectarian politics means that a country like Lebanon and the rest of the region, there's very little margin of constructive political organization. So politics is distorted in countries that have been designed around consociation arrangements. And that's why change can come from grassroots, but grassroots alone does not create political forces. It creates pressure, but then someone has to assume power, and power has to come from some version of elites.
Yeah, but of course, but it's the grassroots that we've got elites together. But from the way, and I think it's not the first time I think like a Mrs. Scholar talking about the rule of elites. And for me, it's kind of like problematic when you talk about the constitutional even change in Lebanon, which is part of the change. You know, you need them all to come together. But you talk about elites alone, then you are repeating the problem in a different way, because of course they are benefiting from sectarianism, from all of these things. So why would you assume that anybody as an elite would do such a change. That was my, like, it's an interesting point. Right?
Yeah, I think we're thinking about elites differently. So when I say elites, I'm not only thinking of sectarian warlords and the entourage that have entered the state. Elites are also aspiring elites. So academics, judges, lawyers, civil rights activists, political figures that emerge organically from within the communities. So elites are just people that have influence in a sense. So that's why I say aspiring elites are people that are challenging traditional status quo. So I don't have a negative connotation to elites, basically.
But aren't the elites
So I've now got 3 questions coming in, so if we can keep the discussion to something separate, thank you very much. But thanks for kicking it off. Gentleman here, then a lady, then a gentleman here.
I'm Drury. I'm with the Rights Realisation Centre, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre. But I just kind of want to pick up on sorry, and anybody who was saying, in a way, I think it's one thing that will come up over and over again in the course of today is the component of the state, this rather amorphous, shifting jello-like, sand-like creature that we'll call the state. I mean, I think Ibrahim, you and indeed Ruba as well, you were addressing some components, and I think in a way, just like in any other state, those are different. Moving on to another very second quick point as kind of an example of that, with the sectarian hat on. If you're a Hada in Kuwait City and you're a Shia, the state's great. The state's not bad. If you're a Shia and a Badoon, well, that's a different story. So that component nature, what is the how it's made up, I think is something that we're going to come back to over and over again. And what is that? And that vision that you set out at the end, Ibrahim, about a civil state, a kind of classical liberal kind of vision there, I thought was quite interesting. Observation on your survey, which I'd love to learn more about Simon and the Lancaster team. I don't know, like in Iran, what you often get, be very quick. Who's speaking in the name of the nation? Well, the Islamic Republic has a number of people who say so they speak in the name of the nation. But actually, there's a coalition of, say, Kurds, LGBT activists, Baluchis, say, well, no, actually, the true Iran is represented by the democratic forces that are Baluchi, Kurd, Sunni, non-sectarian, LGBT, you name it. So how they're using language in the expression of we are true representatives of the state, whoever. I don't know, I think that's something that's going to come up over and over again as well.
I'm going to take these questions together, so we do this round of questions, and then everybody on the panel can have an answer. Madam at the back.
Everyone, I'm Christina One, based at Arms University, part of the SEPAD project. So my question picks up on Salah's comment to Ibrahim, but I would love also to hear Simon's reflections on this. So Simon, you say that reimagining the role of sectarian identities lived that village, and I understand what you mean. But how do you then explain the overwhelming involvement of working classes and poor classes in both the Lebanese and Iraqi protest? I know the whole formation of an oppositional movement, which is Jihad, has been very much fueled by those people you call the elites, so university students, scholars, thinkers, people from the, let's say, upper middle class. But I'm starting to see a shift. Or would you rather say that those workers and poor that are in the streets have been there for the past almost 3 years now are merely the constituencies of sectarian parties speaking to the sectarian Zanis, asking them to change their policies in a way that sort of favors their very livelihood demands rather than a working class or force that challenges the politicization of sectarian identities. Yeah, and I'm very interested in hearing this and Simon's comments on this as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And last one in this round.
From Kareem, I'm a secret fellow from the meeting at the University of Birmingham. So my question is more related to instances of sectarian violence, actually, because sectarianism is a bigger bubble, which is very complicated. But I want to ask, how do events, especially religious events and events involving religious performativity, how do they impact sectarian violence, especially, and then overall contribute towards further sectarianization of societies and states? and in weaker states, or let's say a state which is democratic and partially dependent upon these same communities for legitimacy, how would that state regulate such instances? And just linking it to the second point, that maybe there is a problem not at the sectarian core, but at the sectarian fringes. Because if I am a Sunni and living in Karbala, I think I am the odd one out, so everyone knows me, and I also am very respectable for whatever is done there. But if I am living somewhere else, where on a fringe, then an instance, a performativity event will sharpen my religious identity and lead to violence. So what would then the state do, especially if the state actually is dependent on these same religious civil society actors for its legitimacy and for its power?
Okay, thank you. Three insightful questions highlighting different aspects of what each has been talked about. Who wants to start? If we do the same order as we kicked off, Simon, Ruba, and Ibrahim.
Yeah, lots of really interesting stuff. Who speaks for the nation? The people, I think. And in our survey, we've tried to make sure that it is the people. It's a phone survey, so we've tried to be representative. But we can talk more about that in due course. Middle class privilege, yeah, is a really important point. I think my understanding of what Ibrahim is getting at is that when you have the luxury of not having to fight to put food on your table, then you can think about what does it mean to belong. But when you are struggling to pay for food, to pay for fuel, to pay for electricity, then that sort of existential rumination is a luxury, right? And so, yeah, I think it's really, really important, but I don't quite know how to reconcile those things. Yeah, the fringes, I think you're right. That's for me at least, it's those lines of inclusion and exclusion at the fringes that pose the biggest challenges to creating a more harmonious and inclusive state, and negotiating those fringe interactions that are further away from the core project is challenging. And that's where we see the clashes across lots of different places. I'll leave it there, conscious of that.
Ruba, and answer any of the questions you wish, or all of them.
Who speaks for the nation or people? I mean, that's a question we can ask in any context, not just in the Middle East. If the government is elected, then it should be speaking for the people. But if it's not elected, if it's, bargained into power, then there's a problem. It doesn't necessarily speak for the people, but the people speak for themselves through their mobilization, through their activism, through their self-expression. And like Ibrahim said, and with regards to class battles for recognition, in interviews that I conducted, someone said that in Iraq, many people are just struggling for survival, and they don't have the privilege of talking about sectarianism in particular. They would just say, I need to survive, I need to put food on the table. So it's the same concern. But I don't want to give away much, but I do talk about, in a panel later, about the role of cultural elite in equipping the people with the tools to challenge the status quo and to push for the desectarianization process. So everyone, every member of society has the role to play, and the cultural elite, not the political elite, want to contribute to the desectarianization process. And I'll elaborate more later in that panel. And that will speak to the third question about fringe groups and marginalized groups and intersectionality, because many people don't fit into one group necessarily. They fit into more than one identity and are subject to intersectional oppression. So I'll talk more about that at a later panel.
I think that's called a taster. You just led with Ibrahim.
Yeah, I'll start with your point. Thanks, Simon, for clarifying it. It sounded a bit elitist if I'm saying that working class people cannot reimagine their identities. I just, in my head, there's a book, I forgot who wrote it, about Egypt and the traffic and trying to link the systemic uninterest by the regime to sort traffic issues in Egypt as part of distracting people. So there's headspace for people, there's time they spend on an everyday basis. If they are busy doing other things, then how far can they go with reimagining the kind of society they want? And in the context of economic crisis like the one we're seeing in Lebanon, that's when I'm saying there's a segment of society that is relatively economically autonomous from the sectarian parties. So they don't have to stand in queues and present loyalties to their sectarian parties in their villages to be able to have access to resources. These are the ones that have a bit more margin of maneuver, and that's where, in the context of a crisis, they are the ones that can present possibly viable alternatives to how to order society. But otherwise, you're right. I mean, in the context of the protests, the working class people in rural areas, they were at the forefront of questioning the state we live in. But yeah, that's the context. I just want to add one last thing quickly on the state. What can the state do on the violence? This links to my answer to the 13 MPs question that Alistair suggested. I think the state can simply provide healthcare education. I'm not saying it's a causality. I'm just saying in the midst of crisis and violence, once we reduce the grip of sectarian parties on people's everyday needs, that's when religious identity becomes less paramount. Because then I can think of differences as being less existential. If the state is offering me and my kids healthcare education without me having to present loyalties to specific sectarian parties. And that's why in the context of Lebanon, a bold policymaker that wants stability is the one that says, I want to allocate losses now, not by bailing the banks, the crooked banks, but by taking this money and producing an NHS for Lebanon, which is exactly what happened in Britain in the midst of a crisis, and education and healthcare. That's how you start allowing people to reimagine sectarian identities, because they don't have to worry about healthcare and education anymore.
Would the state be a democratic one?
I would like to think so, but it's not my priority. My priority is to provide people the economic means to be autonomous enough to challenge whatever state exists.
And that leads nice. I'm sorry,
Sorry,
Ruba,
one
please.
last, a quick point. Maybe we need to stop addressing democracy as an absolute thing, whether it exists or not, whether a state is democratic or not, just like sovereign or not. Maybe we can just look at it as a process, a democratization process. So Iraq, for example, is in the very early stages of it, where it can be easily sabotaged and hijacked. And so maybe if we look at each country as like in a stage of the democratization process, some are regressing, some are progressing. Just a thought.
Thank you. I think that leads very neatly into what will be the next panel in a few minutes' time, which will look at the state. If I could lob something into your conversation, it would be from an external point of view. How is democracy defined, and how do you separate democracy from consent? In that consent is really important. You can look at a process of election in Iran, but it would be very difficult to say that that government rules by consent. And there are other states with no elections at all, but it would be very difficult to say that that state didn't have a degree of consent between those who ruled and those who were governed. So it's a fascinating thing. I want to thank our panelists for their time this morning on this panel. This just opens up the conference for the day. I'm sure it'll be very successful and we'll lots to talk about. There's now a 10-minute break where people can get a coffee and whatever needs to be done at home, and people to be back at 11:30 for the next session. But can we thank our panelists for their